Today, it's not unusual to see everyone taking turns drinking from a water fountain. But it may surprise you that not so long ago, it could have been against the law. Of course, that's not the way it is now, thanks to the Civil Rights Act, passed in 1964. Civil rights are freedoms guaranteed to all Americans by the United States Constitution. Unfortunately, for many years, African Americans did not enjoy the same rights that white Americans did. After many years of struggle, the civil rights movement helped African Americans achieve equal rights. Today, we'll explore the civil rights movement. We'll learn about the people and events that helped give all Americans the same rights and liberties. When people talk about the civil rights movement, they are usually referring to the protests that took place during the 1950s and 1960s. But actually, African Americans have been fighting for their freedom since they were first brought to America as enslaved people hundreds of years ago. Enslaved people had no rights at all. They were bought and sold just like property. Many enslaved people worked on large plantations or farms in the southern states. They grew and harvested sugar, tobacco, and cotton. And they never got paid for their work. It was a very difficult way of life. By the 1800s, there were about 4 million enslaved people who lived and worked in America. It was about that time many Americans began organizing and speaking out against slavery. People who wanted to get rid of or abolish slavery were called abolitionists. An important abolitionist of the time was William Lloyd Garrison, who lived in Boston, Massachusetts. Garrison started an anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator. In 1833, Garrison and a group of other abolitionists started the American Anti-Slavery Society. The society, which included both African American and white members, wanted to end slavery in America. They worked hard to convince other Americans that slavery was wrong. Frederick Douglass, who had escaped after years of slavery, became a leader in the abolitionist movement. He began speaking to groups and writing about his horrible experiences as a slave. Some abolitionists risked their lives helping slaves escape to freedom. They did it through the Underground Railroad. It was not a real railroad, but rather a secret network of safe houses that helped fugitive enslaved people move from the South to the North. If an enslaved person made it north, they would be free because slavery was not legal in most northern states. Harriet Tubman, who had escaped slavery, helped guide more than 300 enslaved people to freedom on the Underground Railroad. By the 1850s, people in America were deeply divided over slavery. When Abraham Lincoln, a critic of slavery, became president in 1860, people in the South thought he would try to end slavery and ruin their way of life. Eventually, the states in the South declared that they were no longer part of the United States of America. President Lincoln wanted to keep the nation together. He said he would do anything to save America, even go to war. So, the North and the South fought against each other during the Civil War. A civil war is a war between people of the same country. During the war, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation means to set free. The Emancipation Proclamation set all enslaved people free. Right after the Civil War, many Southern states passed laws to keep African Americans apart or segregated from white people. These laws were known as Jim Crow laws, named after a fictional character that was very offensive to African Americans. Jim Crow laws were made to keep black people and white people apart on trains, in restrooms, in schools, and restaurants too. In 1896, Homer Plessy challenged the Jim Crow laws by sitting in a railroad car reserved for white passengers. He was arrested and found guilty of breaking Louisiana's segregation laws. He appealed to the Supreme Court in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. But in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation, or keeping blacks and whites apart, was legal. It was known as the separate but equal doctrine. Things were kept separate, but they definitely were not equal, especially schools. White children went to modern schools and had lots of books, supplies, and teachers. Many African American children went to schools that were run down, one-room buildings with no electricity or running water. They had very few books, teachers, and supplies. Segregation in the northern states was different. There weren't laws stopping whites and African Americans from eating in the same restaurants or using the same bathrooms or going to the same schools. However, separate neighborhoods kept schools segregated. In 1909, W.E.B. Du Bois and other African American leaders formed the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The organization fought for equal rights for African Americans, and they started by challenging segregation. NAACP lawyers brought segregation cases before the Supreme Court. Slowly, things began to change. In 1947, Jackie Robinson became the first African American baseball player to play in the major leagues. Before that, players could only play in leagues of their race. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman ended segregation in the armed forces. Until then, African American and white soldiers served apart. Then, in 1954, Thurgood Marshall, an attorney for the NAACP, argued the case of Brown versus the Board of Education to the Supreme Court. It was about a child named Linda Brown who wanted to attend the school in her neighborhood, even though she was African American. The Supreme Court overruled Plessy versus Ferguson and decided that it was no longer legal for students of different races to be kept in separate schools. But many people called segregationists wanted to keep people apart. Some joined the Ku Klux Klan, a group that used violence to frighten African Americans from exercising their civil rights. Some schools didn't want African American and white children to be taught together or integrated. In fact, sometimes when African American students tried to enter all white schools, protests would occur. In many cases, the police or National Guard tried to make sure that all students entered safely. However, despite the intimidation and struggle, the civil rights movement continued. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks, a member of the NAACP, was on her way home from her job at a department store. She took the bus like she did most days. After paying her fare, Rosa took a seat in the middle section of the bus. That was okay, as long as there weren't any white people to occupy the seats. She sat next to a black man. 2 black women were sitting across the aisle. At the next stop, some white people got on and filled up the remaining seats. But one man was left standing. The driver looked back and saw him. He told Rosa and the other black people around her to give up their seats. The two women sitting across the aisle and the man sitting next to Rosa got up, but Rosa didn't. She was tired of giving in and being mistreated. The bus driver told her again to move, but Rosa refused. Eventually, two policemen came, arrested Rosa, and took her to jail. The NAACP had wanted to challenge the bus laws for many years. They called for all African Americans in Montgomery to boycott or stop using the buses on the day of the trial to show support for Rosa. At her trial, the judge said that she had broken the segregation laws. Outside, the boycott was successful. The buses were empty. The African American leaders of Montgomery formed a new organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. At their first meeting, they decided to continue the bus boycott if the city council and bus company refused their demands for equal treatment on buses. The city council refused, and the boycott continued. The bus boycott was very difficult for people. It made just getting to work and home very difficult. The Montgomery Improvement Association challenged bus segregation and took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. The court agreed and said that drivers could no longer force African Americans to sit in the back or give up their seats to white people. The boycott had worked. Some African Americans chose sit-ins. Sit-ins were a form of protest. People would sit in public places that only served white people. They would stay for long periods of time or until they were served. Sit-ins provided another way to protest segregation without using violence. After the bus boycott, Dr. King became a well-known civil rights activist. He inspired thousands of African Americans to stand up for themselves and to fight peacefully for equality. On August 28, 1963, people from all over the country marched on Washington, D.C. It was called the March for Freedom. The marchers demanded 4 things: that Congress pass the Civil Rights Bill, that schools be integrated by the end of the year, that job discrimination be ended, and that a job training program be put in place. It was a peaceful march filled with hope, especially when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to the marchers. The March for Freedom on Washington, D.C. had a dramatic effect on the country. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, making segregation illegal in all 50 states. But the struggle for civil rights still wasn't over. Many places in the South made it difficult for African Americans to vote. In Selma, Alabama, people held a march in support of voting rights. Their plan was to march 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery, the capital of Alabama. But police stopped them and violence broke out. Crowds attacked the marchers, badly injuring 50 of them. The event became known as Bloody Sunday. 2 days later, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. supported the cause and led another march. Again, police stopped them. To avoid violence, Dr. King turned around and led the marchers back to Selma. 2 weeks later, under the protection of the National Guard, marchers were able to march from Selma to Montgomery in support of voting rights for all Americans. Again, the nonviolent protests caused changes. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, stating that no person could be denied the right to vote because of race or color of their skin. In the same room where President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, over 100 years earlier, President Lyndon Johnson spoke these words:
I want to be the president who helped the poor to find their own way and who protected the right of every citizen to vote in every election.
We've seen that African Americans struggled for civil rights for a very long time. The truth is that almost every minority group has, at one time or another, suffered from inequality and discrimination. For example, there was a time in America when women were not allowed to vote. The women's suffrage movement protested for many years for a woman's civil right to vote. Suffrage means the right to vote. Finally, Congress passed the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. And for many years, people with disabilities were subject to discrimination. Finally, in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. It is now illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities. Today, we all enjoy the civil rights that so many people have fought for so long. There have been many success stories in the struggle for equality and civil rights. Yet, there are still groups of people who are discriminated against in America. As Americans, we must continue to carry on the work of leaders like Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. We must make sure that we treat people equally and fairly, and we must respect one another's differences.